later, everyone comes to me.
Every account of Nazmir begins the same way. A swamp, a stench, trolls with red hands and hollow eyes, kneeling in water that is not entirely water, singing to something that should never have been born. The story arrives already finished, the verdict already written across it. Madness, corruption, savagery, and nobody thinks to ask the one question the verdict quietly steps over on its way to the end. No one in that swamp ever set out to worship rot. If they had simply been monsters, the swamp would be easy to explain, and Nazmir would be nothing more than a warning told in the dark. But the ruins in that mire are not the ruins of monsters. They are temples, causeways of cut stone laid straight and true, altars raised by hands that believed they were doing something holy. And beneath them, older still, lies a structure built not by trolls at all, but by the servants of the Titans, for a purpose that was, by every measure its makers could apply, entirely rational. So the question is not why the trolls of Nazmir went mad. It is what they thought they were buying. Every altar in that swamp is an offer. Every drained body, every consumed loa, every whispered pact is a payment made against a promise. Follow the chain of those payments back far enough, and you do not arrive at cruelty. You arrive at fear, at people who had run out of every other option and reached for the only one left. So where, along that long descent, does a price stop being a price and become a god? My name is Keeper Aldrich. I have spent the greater part of my life among ruins, first among the Kirintor in Dalaran, where I learned that history is a memory the world keeps badly, and then in the field, walking the places where that memory had been left to rot. Nazmir is the only ruin I have ever entered and understood while I was still in it, that I was standing inside an argument. The land is making a case. It has been making it for longer than the trolls have had a word for kings. And the argument begins long before the swamp did. The Zandalari themselves remember Nazmir as the shining heart of troll civilization. Not a frontier, not a place of exile, the heart. And the great settlement of that country was Zul Nazman, a name the blood trolls now use for their own capital, though they did not build it. They inherited it. Set that beside the other thing they say of their founding, that their first king led them out of the muck and the mire, and the two accounts scrape against one another in a way worth pausing over. Both can be true at once, and the likeliest reading is that they are. A homeland souring beneath its own greatness, still magnificent, still theirs, already turning. The evidence is still there, though it takes a certain patience to see it. Broken columns rise from the reeds at intervals too regular to be accidental. Staircases climb toward doorways that open onto nothing but green water. There are foundations under the silt that a careful hand can still trace, and they do not belong to a scattered people. They belong to a civilization that expected to remain. They did not remain. The land gives up the reason slowly, and in a shape that no one who lives there cares to look at directly. Scattered across Zandalar stand three great pyramids, Atul Nazman, standing in the eastern reaches of Nazmir at a place called Nazwatha, Atul Aman, far to the west in what is now the desert of Voldun, and the great seal that sits at the heart of Dazar Alor itself, the golden capital, the pride of the empire, the throne of the troll world. 3 monuments in 3 regions, separated by mountains and by whole ages of history. They have been called temples. They have been called wonders. Priests have prayed in them. Kings have been crowned beneath them. Every one of them faces the same point. Not the sea, not the sun, not the sacred mountain. They face inward toward a single point in the middle of Nazmir, and at least two of them once had roads running from their bases toward it. Long, deliberate roads, the kind built when something must be reached quickly and often. Fragments of them survive. Follow those fragments, and they do not end at a shrine. They end at a pit in the earth that the blood trolls came to call the altar of rot. And beneath that pit, buried under the mire in the centuries, is a facility of Titan make called Uldir. The pyramids are not temples, they are locks. The Zandalari raised their empire on top of a containment measure, then forgot what they were containing, then knelt down and worshipped in it. The geography of Zandalar is not a landscape, it is a diagram misread by every generation that inherited it. Standing at the edge of one of those causeways, with the water lapping at the stone, I found I could not think of the place as a swamp any longer. I was standing on the roof of a prison, and so had every Zandalari who ever knelt in that mud to pray. The question, of course, is what the prison was for. The answer is not a troll answer at all. It belongs to an age before the trolls had any say in the matter. Azeroth, the servants of the Titans had discovered, was not merely a world with a problem. She was a world with a parasite. The old gods, sunk into her flesh, entwined so deeply that killing them threatened to kill the patient along with the disease. Every solution they devised ended the same way, the corruption removed, the world dead. So they built Uldir, not a temple, not a fortress, a research facility and a quarantine where the keepers could take the old gods apart and study what they found. They dissected them. They probed the mechanism of that ancient hunger because they meant to excise it cleanly, and to that end they pursued the one property that mattered most, the endless, self-perpetuating need to corrupt whatever it touched. And in pursuing it, they made it, not a copy, not a model, a living distillation of the very hunger they had set out to cure, rot and pestilence and decay, with no limit to its appetite and no capacity to stop, a thing that would consume its host until there was no host left, and then go looking for another. The chroniclers call it a fifth old god, though it was never truly of the same stock as the four that came from beyond the stars. It was born here. It was made here. It was an accident of caution, and they named it G'huun. Everything that follows grows from that root. The greatest minds this world has hosted, working with the cleanest intentions, chasing a cure that would have saved everything, built the most complete engine of ruin the planet had yet seen. They accepted a terrible risk for a necessary end, and they lost. They did not, however, panic. The keepers sealed their failure where it had been made, locking G'huun inside Uldir itself and binding the facility shut with 3 seals, each one built into the architecture of those great pyramids scattered across the continent. The roads were laid so the seals could be tended. A watcher was left behind, Titan Keeper Hezrel, whose entire purpose, for ages beyond counting, was to stand over that buried thing and make certain it stayed buried. It is here that Nazmir's argument first shows its face. The keepers' logic was flawless, their intentions clean, and what they left behind was a wound that could never be closed, only guarded. They had paid a price for something they believed they needed. The trolls who came after would do the same thing again and again, in cruder forms and with darker hands, and the world would call the trolls savages and the keepers tragic. The difference between those verdicts is not moral. It is the difference between a mistake made in a laboratory and a mistake made in a swamp. In time, even that guard would fail, not through treachery, through something far more ordinary. The trolls did not build Nazmir in ignorance of Uldir. That is the detail most telling skip. They lived beside it. Their oldest city grew up around that place, on top of it, in the shadow of a thing they knew was there. What survives of their writing in that country is fragmentary, but the fragments point one way, and it is not a comforting one. The seals were not perfect. The corruption reached, slowly, patiently, in a way that no single generation would have called an emergency. G'huun's rot pressed outward through the earth, twisting the land, sickening the water, warping the creatures that drank from it. The soil turned, the rivers thickened. What had been the shining heart of the trolls began, year by year, to sour. And so the first king came. His name was Dazar, and every Zandalari child since has learned him as a founder, the one who raised the Golden City, gave the empire its shape, and left his name stamped on its capital forever. What is said less often is what he actually did. He led his people out of the muck and the mire. He took them south, away from the sickening ground, up onto the high slopes beneath the sacred mountain, and there they built Zuldazar, and in time, Dazar Alor. The founding of the greatest troll city in the world was, at its origin, an evacuation. Consider how completely that has been reframed. A retreat from a poison the trolls could neither fight nor cure became the origin story of an empire. Glory extracted from flight, triumph written over surrender, a golden capital raised as a monument to a battle nobody won. And the ground they fled was not cleansed by their leaving. It only stopped being watched. That is the true beginning of the swamp, not a curse, not a flood, abandonment. Nazmir drowned because no one was left in it to hold the water back, and the rot came up through ground that no longer had a city sitting on it to argue. What happened next is the quietest catastrophe in Zandalari history, and it happened over so many centuries that no chronicler ever thought to write down the day it occurred. The Zandalari forgot. They forgot why the pyramids faced inward. They forgot what the roads had been for. Nazmir stood in the swamp with its seal intact and its purpose erased, and the great seal of Dazar Alor became simply the floor of a throne room, walked on daily by kings who had no notion that they were standing on a lock. Hezrel, who had kept his watch since before the trolls had a word for time, fell into disuse and was taken by the people of Nazmir for an old statue, a curiosity in the reeds, weathered and silent, worth no more than a passing glance. That is what a forgotten guardian looks like, not a ruin, just a shape that people have stopped asking about. G'huun waited. Rot is not in a hurry. Rot does not need to plan or muster or march. It only needs the world to keep doing what the world does anyway, which is to move on and to forget. Everything comes to it in time. It did not wait idle, though, and the reach of the thing was longer than its prison should have allowed. Far to the west, where Voldun's dunes now roll over what was once green country, a servant of the blood god came for the seal of Atul Aman. Mithrax, called the Unraveler, one of the great Kesraks, laid siege to that place, and how G'huun summoned him from inside a sealed vault is a question the records do not answer, and I will not pretend to. What is certain is the outcome. The Loa Setralese gave her life to bring him down. She succeeded and still failed. The seal was already broken, and the Sethrak keepers who survived her bound the monster's corpse beneath the pyramid so that nothing could raise it again, a precaution that would prove less permanent than they hoped. The land around that battle was left all but lifeless. Vol'dun is a desert because of a fight over a lock that most of the world had already forgotten existed. 2 seals remained, and in Nazmir, the ground itself had begun to make offers. Here the story turns, and it turns on one figure whose name deserves better than the obscurity it has: Kelvak's Deathwalker. He was no monster arriving from outside. He was a troll of the swamp among the worshippers of Bwonsamdi, the Loa of Death, for Nazmir was Bwonsamdi's country long before it was G'huun's. His shrine stood at the necropolis and at the Terrace of Sorrows, and the Zandalari came to them in their thousands to make their peace with the end. And that is precisely the vulnerability. Consider what Bwonsamdi offers and what he does not. He guards the souls of trolls. He bargains for them. He holds them. But he does not give them back. To follow the Loa of Graves is to accept the grave, a faith built on the acknowledgement that everything ends, and that the most you can hope for is someone reliable waiting on the other side. Now stand in that congregation while the water rises, while your children sicken on the rot in the ground, while the earth you were born on turns beneath your feet, and the God of death offers precisely what he has always offered, a fair accounting once you are gone. And then hear another voice come up out of that same earth, saying, I do not require your death. I require your blood, and I will give you life that does not end. Kelvax took that bargain. He turned the worshippers on the Terrace of Sorrows away from Bwonsamdi and toward the blood god, and G'huun rewarded him precisely as promised. He was made deathless, a lich in troll flesh, with dominion over the dead who had once belonged to another. His is the earliest conversion in that country we can put a name to with any confidence, though it is difficult to believe it was truly the first. A thing that reaches as patiently as G'huun does not begin with a success. The temptation is to call it a fall. It was not a fall. It was an upgrade offered by a God who could deliver to people whose old faith had always been honest about the fact that it never could. That is the machinery this entire history runs on. Not evil, not madness, a better deal. From there the corruption spread the way corruptions actually spread, not in a single night of horror, but in a slow drift, generation by generation. Heretics appeared among the faithful of Nazmir, defiling the old shrines, killing those who would not turn, dragging the rest with them. Zandalari, who had clung to blood magic long after the rest of their people turned from it, found in the swamp a country where their craft was not merely tolerated, but sanctified. And when enough of them had gathered and enough generations had passed, they were no longer Zandalari at all. They were something else, with their own name for themselves and their own city. And the city they took was Zul-Nazman, the old heart, the place the empire had walked away from. The blood trolls did not invade Nazmir. They are what was left in it. Their society is one of the most complete expressions of a single idea I have encountered anywhere on this world. Everything in it serves the transaction. Power runs through the matriarchs, the matas, the war mothers, and beneath them the males serve without question, drudges, punished or offered up if they do not, because a people organized around what can be taken from a body has no use for anyone who might argue about whose body it is. Their poisons are brewed to paralyze rather than kill, because a corpse is worth less than a living captive who can still be bled. They build almost nothing, and not because they cannot. It is doctrine. Their God has no need of towers or ships or any craft at all. He needs blood, and what he gives in return requires no infrastructure. Even the beasts of that country are conscripts. The krogs that patrol the shallows and haul their war parties through the mire began as the spawn of Kragwa, the great frog Loa of Nazmir, tadpoles lifted out of the marsh and steeped in blood magic until they came back out with teeth. The blood trolls are not farmers of grain or hunters of game. They are a people who learned to farm the sacred. To the empire in the south, they became a story for children. Behave, or the swamp will send someone for you in the night. A whole people reduced to a bedtime threat by the descendants of those who left them there. The Zandalari looked north into the mire, saw the boogeymen of their own nursery tales, and never once saw the mirror. Because the blood trolls are not a deviation from Zandalari religion. They are its logical conclusion, drawn by people who were desperate enough to follow the reasoning all the way to the end. Every troll faith on Zandalar is transactional. You offer, and the Loa answers. You give, and you are given. The Zandalari built a whole theology of pacts and prices and sacred debts, and were horrified to find that some of their kin had located a god who would honor the arrangement without limit and without mercy. A god who never says no, so long as you keep paying. Faith in Nazmir is not belief. Faith is a receipt. And that is why the swamp nearly ended the world. The blood trolls are not fanatics in the way the word is usually meant. Their God is real, he answers, and his gifts work. Every promise Gahun made to them, he kept. There is no crack in that faith to work a lever into, no disappointed believer waiting to be turned, because nothing has ever disappointed them. That is what makes them terrifying, not their savagery, but their satisfaction. So when the world broke, they were the only people on Zandalar who were ready for it. The breaking is a matter of record, and the Zandalari have never recovered from the humiliation of it, because one of their own had told them exactly what was coming, and they had laughed. Zul, prophet, leader of the Zanchuli Council, childhood friend of King Rastakhan, had carried true visions since he was a boy. That is not the flattery of his followers. It is the assessment of the court that despised him. He saw a great armored dragon with the world clenched in its jaws. He saw serpents pouring from a fissure torn in the ocean floor. He came before his king with his clothes rent and his staff thrown down, and told him the golden city would slide into the sea. Rastakhan did not believe him. The council did not believe him. They took it for a bid at influence, the theater of a man reaching for more power than he had been given. And to be rid of the noise, the king handed Zul the ships and told him to go and find his other land, if he was so certain of it. Then Deathwing broke the world, and Zul was right. Zandalar cracked. Earthquakes and tidal upheaval tore at the island. Nazmir shook and began to slide into the sea, and somewhere in that ruin, the seal of Atul Nazman failed. Whether the breaking of the world shook it loose, or whether the servants of the blood god tore it down while the empire's attention was elsewhere, is a matter on which the accounts do not agree, and I am not inclined to force them to. What is not in dispute is the result. 2 of the 3 locks were gone. Only the great seal remained, the floor of a throne room in a golden city, guarded by a court that did not know what it was guarding. And Zul, who had been right about everything and heeded in none of it, drew a conclusion. This is the part of his story I cannot dismiss, however much I would like to. He had spent a lifetime watching gods and kings fail to prevent what he had plainly seen coming. He was with the Zandalari in Zuldrak during the war against the Lich King, and watched the Drakari there butcher their own Loa for scraps of power, and watched it fail to save them. His people prayed, and the water rose anyway. What Zul concluded was not that the gods were false. It was that they were weak, that a pantheon which could not stop the world from breaking was not worth the incense burned before it. He knew exactly where one was buried. So the prophet who had tried to save his people from a drowning went to work on the last loch in the world, with the fanatics of the swamp as his army and a handful of the empire's own great, Yasma, Jakrazet, as his instruments. He did not think of himself as a traitor. I doubt very much that he ever used the word. He thought of himself as the only man on Zandalar willing to pay what survival actually cost. And the terrible thing, the thing that keeps this from being a simple story, is that by the standards his people had taught him, he was not wrong. Give, and you are given. Pay, and be answered. He had learned that in the same temples as everyone else. He simply believed it more than they did. What followed, in the year 33 after the opening of the Dark Portal, is the closest Nazmir has ever come to finishing its argument. The blood trolls came out of the swamp in force, and they came for the gods themselves. Torga, the turtle Loa, wise and gentle, the keeper of stories, to whom the Tortolans had made pilgrimage for generations simply to sit and listen, was killed in the mire. They ate him. That is not metaphor. They consumed his flesh, and they used his blood to raise the dead and to call up Jungo, a herald of the blood god, out of the corpse of a creature whose great crime was that he had been kind. The place where his body fell is called Torga's Rest. There is no ground in all of Nazmir that made me angrier to stand on. Hir'eek, the Bat Loa, lord of the midnight sky, they did not kill. They took him. He was corrupted, turned, made into a servant of the very thing his worshippers had prayed to be spared from, and he preached the blood god's hunger to the swamp in his own voice. Ending him fell to a Zandalari troll named Jochunga, who walked into the blood troll village of Zalamar wearing their paint and their manner as a disguise, and who brewed the poison that finally brought the Loa down in the sanctum of midnight. The detail I cannot put down is where that poison came from. It was distilled out of talismans Hir'eek himself had blessed. They killed the god with his own benediction, and I know no cleaner image of what Nazmir does to faith. Kragwa, the frog, fared no better in the beginning. The blood trolls besieged him in his own marsh, drained his children of their blood to feed the rites, slaughtered every last one of his worshippers in that country, and made ready to sacrifice the Loa himself. Bwonsamdi himself was found in his necropolis, with his own faithful drifting away from him, spirits abandoning the keeper of graves for the god who promised no graves at all. He would help. Of course he would help. He is not a creature who refuses a bargain. But he would help for a price, and the price he named was 1,000,000 souls. There is the whole history of the swamp in a single sentence. Even the Loa fighting against the blood god could not conceive of aid that was not a transaction. Bwonsamdi did not intervene out of loyalty or wrath. He negotiated the same posture G'huun took in a different register and for a smaller fee, and no one in that temple thought it strange, because in Nazmir it is not strange. Against that went the expedition of Princess Talanji, with Rokan of the Dark Spear and a hard core of trolls who had decided, without much theology to back them, that some things are not for sale. They made their camp in the Zul'Jan ruins. They freed Kragwa, who repaid them in fury. They reached the corpse of Torga before the blood god's herald could finish what was being done to it. They tore the heart out of the blood troll capital and killed Grandmada Atina, the matriarch, in the ruins of the Empire's own first city, a queen of the swamp dying in the streets of Zul Nazman, where the Zandalari story began, and in the depths, where G'huun's rot had crept up through the old burial grounds into the caverns they call the Underrot, Hezrel woke, the forgotten statue in the reeds, the keeper who had stood at his post through the entire rise and fall and re-rise of the troll world, watching a thing that no one else remembered, mistaken by the living for a piece of weathered stone. He was roused, and what came out of him was the plainest sentence in this entire history. Corruption detected. Containment must be enacted. Through him, Talanji learned what her people had been living on top of for the whole of their history, that there was an old god beneath the swamp, and a name for it. He went down into the rot with them. What became of him afterward, the surviving accounts do not agree upon, and I gave up forcing them to long ago. What is not in doubt is the shape of him, and the shape is the whole point. Of every figure in this chronicle, he is the only one who was not making a deal. He asked for nothing. He named no price, took no soul, promised no life beyond the grave. He simply did the thing he had been made to do, in a country where every other power, mortal and Loa and old god alike, had spent thousands of years haggling. That is what stands out in Nazmir, not the horror, the absence of terms. There was one more guardian, and his fate is the cruelest turn in the record. Talok, a titan construct, the Keeper's mightiest, built to patrol this country and cut out corruption wherever it surfaced. For thousands of years, it did exactly that. For thousands of years, nobody maintained it. A machine left alone long enough in a poisoned place stops being immune to the poison, and the blood trolls found it and fed it blood, and turned the swamp's own watchmen into the hammer they meant to swing at Zuldazar. It was never their creation. It was their inheritance, like the city they squat in. When Atina fell, the shield around it failed, and the thing came down through the roof of the chamber they had raised for it, into the depths of Uldir. In the Golden City, at the last lock, the argument ended the way arguments in Nazmir always end. Zul brought Mithrax back, and the blood trolls came with him under a matriarch named Renkala, who died there. Ras Takhan, empowered by the Loa of death, for the king had made his own bargain, and it would cost his daughter dearly, beat the prophet down and cast him from the ledge. Zul died laughing, telling his oldest friend to enjoy ruling a kingdom of ashes, and behind them, while the two of them settled their quarrel, the Kesrax struck the great seal, and it broke. G'huun was free. For a short and terrible span, the thing the Titans could not cure and could not kill was loose beneath Nazmir, with nothing left to hold it. It was ended in the festering core of Uldir at the hands of those who went down into the facility after it, Talanji among them, the dwarf Bran Bronzebeard among them, using the Keeper's own re-origination drive to drag the blood god out of the walls and into the open, where it could finally be struck. Not sealed, not contained, killed, in the room where it had been made by the descendants of everyone who had ever run away from it. So, what was bought in the end? The keepers bought a cure for the world and paid with a monster. Dazar bought his people's survival and paid with their homeland, and the Empire spent ages pretending the payment had been a triumph. Kelvax bought life without end and paid with everything that made a life worth having. The Blood Trolls bought certainty and paid with their children, their Loa, their land, and finally themselves. Zul bought a future for the Zandalari and paid with the Zandalari. Bwonsamdi asked 1,000,000 souls to help save the world and thought it a fair rate, and by the customs of his country it was. Every one of them was rational. Not one figure in this history is a lunatic. Each looked at a real catastrophe, calculated honestly what survival would cost, and paid. The Blood Trolls are not the failure of that reasoning. They are its success. The only people on Zandalar who followed the logic of their own religion all the way to the bottom and did not flinch when they got there. That, I have come to think, is the answer to the question the swamp keeps asking. Sacrifice becomes faith at the exact moment a people can no longer imagine any other way of being answered. Not when they lose their minds, when they lose their alternatives. A price paid once is a decision. A price paid every day for generations, until the paying is the whole of your culture and the memory of not paying has been drowned along with your first city. That is a god. It does not require belief. It only requires that the option of refusal be forgotten, in the same way the Zandalari forgot what their pyramids were for. The swamp is quiet now. I sat on a broken causeway there one evening, the water going black around the stones, and from that angle it looked almost peaceful. The rot has receded. The blood god is dead in his own laboratory. Kragwa croaks in his marsh. Torga has come back into the world as a small turtle riding on a Tortollan's head, which is either the gentlest thing in this chronicle or the strangest. And Bwonsamdi keeps his ledgers in the necropolis, still counting, still owed. The Blood Trolls, by every account that has reached me from the years since, are gone from that country. Where they went, no one has written down. But Zul Nazman is still under the water. Uldir is still down there in the dark, with its instruments and its cells and its empty containment chamber, waiting for someone with better intentions than sense to find a use for it. And the Zandalari still tell their children not to go into the swamp. They have never told them why the roads lead there. That is the record as it survives, and I set it down as I found it. What troubles me is not the ending. It is the beginning, a room full of the wisest beings this world has ever known, deciding that the danger was great enough to justify the risk. The Blood Trolls said the same thing, in cruder words, kneeling in the same mud, above the same door. I have not yet found the line that separates them. I am no longer certain there is one.